The tension inside the courtroom was almost unbearable, thick like a storm cloud ready to burst. Every seat in the gallery was filled, occupied by curious onlookers whispering among themselves, their voices a low hum of speculation. Some leaned forward, eager to witness the spectacle unfold. Others sat back, shaking their heads, convinced they already knew how this was going to end. Rows of HOA board members sat smugly in the gallery, their well-dressed attorneys exchanging knowing glances, already celebrating a victory they hadn't yet won. They thought today would be simple, a quick ruling. At the center of it all stood my grandson, Lucas. A young man just 19, disabled, alone, and seemingly without resources, standing against a powerful homeowners association that had been ruthless in its pursuit of his family's home. They had no idea what was coming. The heavy wooden defendant's table seemed almost comically large compared to his lean frame. He stood beside it, his crutches resting against the edge, untouched. Though he could have used them for support, he chose not to. A silent statement that he would not be seen as weak today. His posture was slightly hunched, the weight of grief still clinging to him. Just months ago, his world had shattered. His parents, his anchors, his protectors were gone, in an instant ripped away by a senseless accident that never should have happened. One rainy evening, they had been driving home from a family dinner, a rare night where laughter had filled the car, where his mom had playfully scolded his dad for missing a turn, where Lucas had felt safe, whole. But then, blinding headlights, the deafening screech of brakes, the violent crunch of metal, a reckless driver speeding through an intersection took them both. Lucas had survived, but just barely. The crash had left him with injuries that would forever remind him of that night. His body healed, but the scars of that moment, of hearing, "The doctors say there was nothing we could do," would never fade. Now the home his parents had fought so hard for, the place filled with their memories, was all he had left of them. And the HOA wanted to take that too. Their tactics were cruel, as cold as they were calculated. The HOA had moved the fence line, encroaching on Lucas's property inch by inch, as if he wouldn't notice. They slapped him with fraudulent violations, chipped paint fine here, an unauthorized wheelchair ramp there. The infractions were fabricated, the fees outrageous. They assumed he wouldn't have the money to fight back. Court cases were expensive, and their lawyers were among the best money could buy. They banked on intimidation and financial exhaustion, but it wasn't just about harassment. No, they had a bigger plan. The HOA knew exactly what they were doing. They were burying Lucas in debt, slapping him with unpayable fines, racking up legal fees he couldn't afford. They weren't just trying to intimidate him. They were setting him up for financial ruin. Because once he couldn't pay, they would strike. A lien here, a missed payment there. Then they'd rip the house from under him, selling it off to one of their own at a fraction of its worth. A grieving orphan thrown onto the street while they profited from his loss. It was cruel, it was calculated, and they thought it was inevitable. They weren't after petty fines. They wanted Lucas's home, and they were convinced that in time he would have no choice but to surrender it. One of the HOA representatives had even chuckled at Lucas before the hearing. "Listen, Lucas," he'd said, a sickeningly sweet smile on his face. "This is just business. You don't have the money and we do. You're going to lose, so why drag it out?" Lucas hadn't responded. He just memorized the smug expression on the man's face. He'd wipe it off soon enough. They had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated Lucas. The HOA board, seated across the room, didn't bother hiding their smirks. To them, Lucas was just a scared, disabled kid in over his head. What was even more painful was the deception from Lucas's parents' friends who were on the HOA board. After his parents were gone, these friends in the HOA, once warm, once supportive, had faded into the background. Lucas had once believed in those people. They had attended his parents' funeral, hugged him with tears in their eyes, whispered empty promises of support. But when the HOA came for him, those same people turned their backs. None of them stood up for him. None of them even warned him of what was coming. He wasn't just fighting the HOA, he was fighting a neighborhood that had already decided he had lost. Some neighbors whispered their sympathies, offered sad smiles, even left casseroles on his doorstep. But sympathy wasn't enough. Lucas had spent sleepless nights staring at the front door, hoping just once that one of them would knock, that one of them would say, "You don't have to do this alone." But no one ever came. Not a single one of them spoke up. Not a single one of them fought for him. Because in this neighborhood, kindness was silent, but fear was loud. In this neighborhood, the HOA always won, until today. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The lead attorney for the HOA, Garrett Caldwell, sat back in his seat, exuding an air of overconfidence as he adjusted his expensive tailored suit. His smug smirk hadn't faded since the moment he walked into the courtroom. To him, this wasn't a case, it was a formality, a performance where he already knew the ending. He wasn't alone in his arrogance. The other HOA lawyers chuckled quietly among themselves, exchanging glances like this was all a joke. The board members sat with folded arms, their expressions dripping with amusement. They were already celebrating. This wasn't a trial to them. It was a spectacle, one where they expected Lucas to fumble, panic, and ultimately lose everything. Garrett finally leaned forward, his fingers lazily tapping against the polished oak table. His sharp gaze swept over Lucas, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "So let me get this straight," Garrett drawled, his voice carrying the same dry amusement one might use when scolding a child for speaking out of turn. "You actually think you can argue this case on your own?" A few chuckles rippled through the HOA side of the courtroom. Their lawyers smirked, the board members shook their heads, and even the HOA secretary, seated in the gallery, covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Lucas didn't say a word. He didn't react to the snide remarks, the quiet laughter, the sheer disrespect dripping from every corner of the room. They thought this was funny. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He just sat there, still, silent, watching, waiting. Then Garrett sighed dramatically, flipping through his neatly organized case file with the casual arrogance of a man who had already won. "Your Honor," he began, dragging out the words as if even speaking them was a waste of time. "Let's not waste the court's valuable time here. We all know how this ends. Mr. Dawson is in blatant violation of HOA rules, and there is no legal precedent that can save him." He paused for effect, casting a quick glance toward Lucas as if waiting for him to shrink under the weight of his words. When Lucas didn't react, Garrett's smirk deepened. "Your Honor," he continued, his voice taking on a feigned air of professionalism, "this case is simple. The defendant, Mr. Dawson, has repeatedly violated HOA regulations, and these aren't minor infractions. These are direct, documented violations that threaten the integrity of our community's property values." He flicked his wrist, picking up a thick stack of papers before dropping them dramatically onto the table. "First and foremost," he continued, his tone condescending, "he has repeatedly ignored notices to correct unapproved modifications to his property. Despite clear HOA guidelines, Mr. Dawson constructed an unauthorized wheelchair ramp which, while unfortunate, violates aesthetic standards outlined in our neighborhood's covenant." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lucas's jaw clenched, but he didn't react. Garrett wasn't done. "There's also the matter of the fence," he went on, flipping a page. "Mr. Dawson has refused to comply with property line adjustments outlined by the HOA's community mapping." Lucas knew exactly what that meant. They had moved the property line, stealing inches of his land and claiming it as theirs, and now they were accusing him of violating it. "The defendant has been issued multiple warnings," Garrett added smoothly. "His fines have gone unpaid. The HOA, in good faith, has tried to work with him, but he refuses to comply." Then came the final blow. "Which brings us to the matter of trespassing." Lucas lifted his head. The defendant was caught accessing property that was no longer his, according to HOA boundary adjustments. The HOA's investigator personally witnessed him violating the property line before issuing fines and penalties. This alone is enough to warrant a violation. Garrett turned toward the jury, shaking his head with mock disappointment. Your Honor, this case isn't just about rules. This is about a homeowner who refuses to respect the very guidelines that keep our neighborhood safe, clean, and desirable. The HOA has given him every opportunity to resolve these issues peacefully, and instead, through his non-compliance with our demands, he has chosen to turn this into a legal circus. Frankly, Your Honor, Garrett continued, this isn't even worth a lengthy trial. The evidence speaks for itself. This young man is desperately trying to hold on to something that no longer belongs to him. Another murmur of agreement from the HOA's table. One of the board members audibly scoffed. Lucas simply watched. Garrett leaned back, completely at ease. He had already won. Lucas was just a formality, a loose end to be tied up. Sitting in the courtroom, Judge Malcolm Reeves remained neutral, his expression unreadable. He wasn't laughing, unlike the HOA's legal team. He wasn't here to make a spectacle out of Lucas's suffering. He tapped a finger against his bench, waiting for the HOA's attorney to wrap up his monologue. Are you finished, Mr. Caldwell? The judge asked, his tone even. Garrett gave an exaggerated nod, closing his case file with a satisfied snap. Yes, Your Honor. I believe the facts speak for themselves. Frankly, I'd rather not spend my entire afternoon on this. I have a golf game at 2. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, mostly from the HOA side. Garrett smirked at the reaction, leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. To him, this wasn't a real case. It was a formality, a waste of time. Judge Malcolm Reeves lifted an eyebrow at the remark, his expression unreadable. He didn't comment. He simply flipped open the case file in front of him, leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something, mild surprise perhaps, before he spoke. Mr. Dawson, he said. Your lawyer? Lucas lifted his chin slightly. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. A ripple of amusement spread through the courtroom. The lead HOA attorney, Garrett Caldwell, smirked. Representing yourself? Garrett let out a low, amused chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, this is going to be fun. Another HOA lawyer shook his head in mock disbelief, letting out a dramatic sigh. Kid, this isn't some school debate tournament. This is real court, real law. You sure you don't want to save yourself the embarrassment? Lucas didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't react. He was used to being underestimated. He had spent his childhood navigating a world that saw his disability before his intellect. He had learned patience, had mastered the art of watching and waiting. His late father, the paralegal, had often told him, the law isn't about who has the most money, it's about who knows how to use it. And Lucas knew. The judge gave a small nod. Very well, proceed. His voice was steady, but for the first time there was a pause, like a brief hesitation, as if even he sensed that something was about to change. No one in the courtroom was laughing when Lucas took his first step forward. The smug smiles, the quiet chuckles, the dismissive glances, they all disappeared. Because for the first time they all really saw him. Lucas gripped his crutches and moved with slow, deliberate precision. Each step was calculated, not because he wanted to draw attention to himself, but because he had no choice. The soft metallic click of the crutch tips against the polished courtroom floor echoed in the silence, a sound that had followed him all his life. A sound that reminded him of every hallway in school where other kids rushed past while he struggled to keep up. A sound that reminded him of every time he was left behind on field trips because no one wanted to wait for him. A sound that reminded him of standing in the rain outside his house after his parents' funeral, gripping those same crutches, listening to well-meaning neighbors murmur, "Poor boy. What's he going to do now?" And now, here he was, standing in a courtroom, facing people who wanted to take away the last thing his parents left him. My wife and I sat in the gallery, our hands clenched together, holding on to each other for strength. We had raised our own children. We had seen hardships, lived through struggles, but nothing prepared us for the weight of watching our grandson fight a battle he should never have had to face. We weren't alone either. Aunties, uncles, family, friends. We were all there. We had come not just to watch but to bear witness, to show the HOA, their smug lawyers, and anyone else who dared to doubt him that Lucas Dawson was not alone. But as much as we wanted to fight for him, we knew this was his moment. Lucas adjusted his stance, his hands tightening around the grips of his crutches. His posture remained straight, his expression unreadable. But the weight of everything was there. The exhaustion, the grief, the quiet defiance. He let the silence stretch just a little too long. Long enough that the amusement in the room turned into discomfort. Long enough that someone in the gallery shifted in their seat, clearing their throat, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. And then, finally, he spoke. "Your Honor," Lucas said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room. "Before I begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Garrett Caldwell, still lounging in his chair, let out an exaggerated sigh. "By all means," he said, folding his arms, his tone dripping with mock patience. Lucas nodded, his expression steady. He met Garrett's gaze without hesitation. "Mr. Caldwell, just to confirm, your case relies on the claim that the HOA's investigator personally witnessed me violating the property line before issuing fines and penalties, is that correct?" Garrett scoffed, barely concealing his boredom. "That's right," he said dismissively. Lucas tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "And that claim is documented in the official HOA report, correct?" Garrett rolled his eyes, already losing patience. "Obviously, it's all in the written report, clear as day." Lucas didn't react. Instead, he shifted his focus to Judge Malcolm Reeves. His voice didn't waver. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." And just like that, the air in the courtroom changed. Judge Malcolm Reeves squinted at Lucas, his brow furrowing slightly. "On what grounds?" The room was still, the weight of the moment pressing against the silence. For the first time since stepping forward, Lucas pulled his hands from his pockets. He adjusted his grip on his crutches before gesturing toward Garrett Caldwell's table, his movements deliberate. Then, with a voice steady and unwavering, he dropped the first bombshell. "Because the HOA's investigator never actually saw me violating the property line. In fact, he wasn't even present when the alleged infraction occurred." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Garrett's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, just enough for Lucas to catch it. But Lucas wasn't done. He had spent weeks preparing for this, late nights combing through surveillance footage, property reports, and timestamps. Hours reading and rereading the HOA's own documents, searching for weaknesses in their case. And now he had found the first crack. The prosecution's entire argument hinged on the investigator's direct observation. Without it, their case was no longer solid. It was crumbling. Lucas straightened his posture, eyes locked on Garrett. "Let's see how he tries to talk his way out of this." Garrett Caldwell recoiled slightly, his smug expression replaced by a flicker of annoyance, quickly masked by a forced chuckle. "Your Honor," he said, turning back to the bench with a condescending air, "the defendant's claim is baseless. Our investigator, Mr. Thomas, is a highly reputable professional. His report is notarized and stands as official documentation of the events." He gestured to the thick file on his table. "This is a desperate attempt by Mr. Dawson to distract from his clear violations." Lucas remained still, his gaze steady on Garrett. "With respect, Mr. Caldwell," Lucas interjected, his voice calm, cutting through Garrett's bluster. "My claim is not baseless. It is based on verifiable facts." Garrett scoffed. "Oh, really? And what facts would those be, Mr. Dawson? Did you hire your own private investigator? Perhaps you have secret cameras hidden in the bushes." The other HOA lawyers snickered. Lucas didn't dignify the sarcasm with a response. Instead, he reached down beside his table and picked up a slim tablet. He tapped the screen a few times. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge directly, ignoring Garrett. "Prior to this hearing, I filed a motion for discovery, requesting, among other things, the GPS records for the HOA's investigator, Mr. Thomas, for the dates specified in his report regarding the alleged trespassing incident." Garrett's face tightened. He hadn't expected Lucas, a self-represented litigant, to have filed any proper motions. let alone one that dug into specifics like GPS data. He vaguely remembered signing off on a stack of boilerplate discovery responses, assuming the kid wouldn't know what to ask for or how to use it. Lucas continued, "The HOA provided those records attached here as Exhibit A." He held up the tablet, displaying a digital document. "According to these very records provided by the HOA themselves, on the date and time Mr. Thomas claims he witnessed me trespassing on the adjusted property line, his vehicle's GPS data places him 17 miles away, at a coffee shop in the next town over." Silence fell over the courtroom, heavy and immediate. The smug expressions on the faces of the HOA board members vanished, replaced by shock and confusion. Garrett Caldwell's jaw went slack. He fumbled for the file, frantically flipping through pages, searching for the discovery response he'd barely glanced at. Lucas didn't press. He let the information hang in the air, let the weight of the revealed lie sink in. The HOA's own evidence contradicted their primary claim. Judge Malcolm Reeves leaned forward, his previously neutral expression now one of keen interest. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his voice sharp, "is this true? Did your discovery response include GPS data for your investigator for the date in question?" Garrett, pale and visibly flustered, finally found the document. His eyes scanned the page, his face growing redder by the second. He swallowed hard. "Your Honor, there appears to be a discrepancy." A wave of murmuring swept through the gallery. My wife squeezed my hand, her eyes wide. The air was thick with disbelief. "This, what?" Garrett stammered. "Your Honor, we may need time to review this. There must be an error. An error that places your key witness 17 miles away when he claims to have been observing the defendant." Judge Reeves's tone was dry. "Motion granted. The testimony and report of Mr. Thomas regarding the alleged trespassing incident are stricken from the record. You may not refer to it or the associated fines as evidence." A small, almost imperceptible nod from Lucas. He had dismantled their first attack with quiet precision, using their own weapons against them. The battle was far from over, but he had just won the first, crucial skirmish. And he had shown everyone in that courtroom that he was not the helpless victim they had expected. He was a fighter, and he was just getting started. Garrett Caldwell sputtered, his face still flushed. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge a clerical issue regarding the fine's issuance," he stumbled over the words, trying to regain his footing, "the core matter remains the encroachment. Mr. Dawson's shed clearly violates the adjusted property line as defined by the Homeowners Association." He gestured vaguely towards a diagram they had prepared earlier, showing the disputed area. Lucas waited for Garrett to finish, then stepped forward again, his crutches clicking softly. He held up another document. "Your Honor, the HOA's claim relies on an adjusted property line. However, the legal and recorded boundary of my property is defined by the original survey and deed filed with the county recorder's office." He presented a copy of a detailed survey map, older and clearly official, distinct from the HOA's diagram. "This survey," Lucas continued, his voice clear and steady, "commissioned at the time of the property's original purchase, shows the boundary line established by meets and bounds." He pointed to a specific line on the map. "According to this legal document, my shed is located entirely within my property lines." He then displayed an aerial photograph overlaid with the survey lines. This photograph, also submitted during discovery, further illustrates that the structure sits well within the legally defined boundaries of my lot. The HOA's adjusted line appears to have been drawn arbitrarily, without reference to the official county records. Garrett jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. The HOA has the right to define community standards and property lines for aesthetic and uniform purposes." Judge Reeves held up a hand, stopping Garrett. "Mr. Caldwell, while an HOA may establish architectural guidelines or setback requirements, they cannot unilaterally redefine legal property boundaries established by recorded deeds and surveys. That is a matter of property law, not HOA rules." He turned his attention back to Lucas. "Mr. Dawson, You are claiming that the HOA's enforcement action is based on a boundary that does not align with the legal description of your property. Precisely, Your Honor, Lucas affirmed. They are attempting to fine and penalize me for violating a boundary that has no legal basis in the county records. He then produced one final document, a letter from the county surveyor's office confirming that the boundary described in Lucas's deed and shown on his survey was the official, recorded boundary for his parcel. The air in the courtroom grew even heavier. The HOA board members exchanged panicked glances. Garrett Caldwell looked like he'd been punched in the gut. His entire case rested on enforcing a boundary that, according to official records, simply didn't exist in a legal sense. Judge Reeves took the documents Lucas presented, examining the survey, the aerial photo, and the county letter carefully. He compared them to the HOA's diagram. The difference was stark. The HOA's line sliced through a portion of Lucas's yard that the official survey clearly designated as his. After a long moment of silence, the judge looked up. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice measured, "the court relies on legal definitions of property. The documents presented by Mr. Dawson, specifically the recorded deed and the certified survey, establish the legal boundaries of his property." He tapped the county surveyor's letter. "Furthermore, we have confirmation from the county that this is the official boundary. The HOA's internal diagram, while perhaps intended for aesthetic planning, does not supersede these legal definitions." He leaned back in his chair, looking directly at Garrett. "Your case for encroachment is based on a boundary line that is not legally recognized. Therefore, the defendant cannot be found in violation of trespassing or encroachment based on that line." Garrett opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. He was defeated, not by a high-priced lawyer, but by a young man with crutches, armed with facts and official paperwork. Judge Reeves turned to Lucas. "Mr. Dawson, you have successfully demonstrated that the HOA's claims of trespassing and encroachment are based on an invalid property line. The investigator's testimony regarding the fine was also shown to be unreliable and based on conflicting evidence provided by the HOA itself." He paused, then delivered the final judgment. "Based on the evidence presented, the court finds in favor of the defendant, Mr. Lucas Dawson. The HOA's claims for fines, penalties, and removal of the structure based on the alleged trespassing and encroachment are hereby dismissed." A collective gasp, followed by a wave of quiet relief and joy, swept through the gallery where our family sat. My wife openly wept, her hands covering her mouth. I felt a lump in my throat, and a wave of pride so strong it almost brought me to my knees. Lucas remained standing, his posture still straight, but a subtle softening in his expression. He had done it. He had stood against the bureaucracy, the indifference, the unfairness, and he had won. He hadn't just defended his property. He had defended his right to stand on his own 2 feet, in his own space, on ground that was legally and rightfully his. He met my eyes across the courtroom. I gave him a small, shaky smile and a nod that held all the love and admiration we felt for him. He nodded back, a quiet acknowledgement of the support that had always been there, even when he had to fight this battle himself. The clicking of his crutches as he turned to gather his papers no longer sounded like a burden, but like the steady, determined beat of a man walking forward, finally free on his own land.